So we owe much of what we have with Washington to serendipity in many different aspects, but there would have been no George Washington in America had it not been that a ship sank in the Potomac in 1656 that was owned by one John Washington, who came to ply the tobacco trade in Virginia. He was an Englishman, of course. He came to Virginia intending just to buy up some tobacco, fill up his ship, and go back home. Instead, a storm came in after he had filled the ship with tobacco, and the ship promptly sank to the bottom of the Potomac. The first thing that John Washington did is something that's very characteristic of the Washington family. He complained a lot. He bickered and he complained and he argued with the owner of the ship over who was responsible for the lost cargo. And once he was done with that, then, like many a Washington, he simply faced facts as they were. Well, here I am. I might as well settle down. He had no intention to settle down before, but he did settle down after his ship sank and decided to start buying land and producing tobacco on his own right. He did another thing that is typical for the male Washingtons, in that he chose and was chosen by a remarkable woman for his wife. The Washingtons make great marriages generation to generation, and they're remarkable for being partnerships of a woman and a man who both have the same attitude. Each of them brings money into the family, yes, and I'll get back to this when we get to Martha, but each of them has the same attitude toward their estate and toward their wealth, which is not just to preserve it and certainly not squander it, but to develop it and improve and increase it in order to pass down to their heirs. So John Washington and his wife certainly do focus on building their estate. And a couple of generations go down and we get to Augustine Washington. Most of us know Augustine Washington, of course, just through the legends and the cherry tree story. There's also a wonderful story created by the same individual, Parson Weems, who told the cherry tree story, who told the story of George Washington, the young George Washington, Augustine's son, and the cabbages. I don't know if any of you have heard the cabbages story, but young George Washington goes out one day into the garden and he sees cabbages sprouting, and they spell the name George Washington. Very clever that. It's because Augustine Washington had mischievously planted these cabbages in order to teach young George something about the Creator. So those are pretty much the only stories we hear about Augustine Washington. He was actually a very interesting fellow in his own right, and himself was a very canny entrepreneur. He invested in many things. Certainly he bought a lot of land. Land was the focus of wealth in Virginia, and tobacco certainly at that time. But he also diversified, in particular into ironworks, something called the Principio Ironworks. And he was so kind of busy and engaged in his business in a way much of the time that he was very fortunate in his second wife, George Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington. Now, do any of you know anything about George Washington and hear the stories about his parents? What you usually hear about George Washington's mother is pretty negative. It's essentially what it comes down to is that George and his mom didn't get along. And we assume, of course, George is always right, so it must be they didn't get along because she was not a good person, which is completely false. She was a very important person, very important for what she passed down and through who she was, in that she was a very intelligent, very strong-willed, very focused manager. She believed in certain basic principles, but her focus was on the estate, ensuring that the estate was managed well, and ensuring that her children would know how to be stewards of their portion of the estate. Now, in those days, When the man of the household, as Augustine often was away, he traveled to England for his various ventures, his business ventures. He went down to visit his ironworks. He was away a lot. The woman, for a large estate like they had to do a lot of things. She had to be a manager. She wasn't using like 1950s appliances to do the washing and cook the dinners and tidy up around the house, but she had to herself take over the whole enterprise. She had to allocate labor. She had to direct work. She had to communicate with agents, with other business people. She had to make investments, often day to day. She had to manage the money. And Mary Washington was extremely good at that. She was a very serious woman. She was rather strict with her kids, and I think that's why George got annoyed with her. But the principles that she passed down to him were focused on such things as diligence, thrift, sobriety, focus. And when Augustine Washington died, when George Washington was 11, and Mary Ball Washington had to take charge of George's education, she insisted that it be a very practical education, that it be focused on his learning things such as mathematics, accounting, bookkeeping, geometry, and other really very practical skills. And George was resentful about this later on because he wanted kind of a more rounded liberal arts type education. He eventually had to teach himself, which he would do, but one of the reasons he was so good at teaching himself and educating himself was because of the principles his mother had given to him. And she passed down to all of her kids.